listening to Dallas Theological Seminary's Chapel Podcast.
If you're like me, you can't imagine Dr. Eugene Merrill knowing a little bit about anything. A scholar and a churchman whom we dearly love, and so it's just humbling to realize his humility as well, isn't it? It's great. We've appreciated our lecture this week. Let me just again mention a book that he has written called How Africa Shaped the Christian Mind, which would be a great companion to the lectures that he has developed and is delivering this week. And it's published by InterVarsity Press, and you're welcome to find it in our bookstore or on online with Amazon or whoever you might choose to find books, but with whom you might choose to find books. Would you welcome back to our chapel platform again this morning, Dr. Tom Oden. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to be with you. I only regret that I've had not very much time to have one-on-one dialogue with you who are students here. I have had some and enjoyed it a great deal. I have an appointment immediately after this session, but I am going to reserve some time after the last session on Friday, and I'll just be down here somewhere and we'll just talk as long as you have available. Now, we are talking today about the interface, the two-way street between Africa and Asia in two different ways, by land and by sea. Classical Christianity, both in the Old and the New Testament, has its roots in a narrative of a history, of a people who are formed in a close linkage between two great continents. Beginning with Exodus, and even before Exodus, Africa has never been a secondary or tertiary partner in the history of salvation. Both by land and by sea, this has been an open engagement and interchange from the earliest times of history. And I think this is symbolized in four gospel narratives, which I'm briefly going to just point to. First of all, the flight of the Holy Family to Egypt, to the Nile Valley. And there are many 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th century churches up and down the Nile that celebrate and remember the presence of the Holy Family in Africa and in the Nile Valley. Africa was a natural place of refuge for those who are troubled in Judea. And if you go to Old Cairo, don't miss the Coptic Museum there. It's in the southern part of the great city of Cairo, huge city. And there you will see a Roman fort that dates back to Roman times, but even before Roman times, in my view. And that location has been a refuge for Jews and for Christians over many, many years. The second narrative is the Ethiopian eunuch, who immediately, as Luke's narrative says, sets out for Africa after his baptism and continues on his way, headed to what was then the most southerly known land of Africa, namely Ethiopia or Cush. Third narrative is the narrative of Simon of Cyrene. And you could add to that Apollos of Alexandria and John Mark, who is reputed to have been born in Cyrene by the African memory. And then the fourth one would be Pentecost, in which in Luke's narrative we have a recollection of Cyrenaic Christians in Jerusalem, right there among that group at Pentecost. These are all symbolic of this interchange of the two continents, and I think they symbolize that the Christian witness has continued without cessation to flow in this nexus of history-making places, all the way to today, where there are over 400 million African Christian voices. So that no African century since the Ethiopian eunuch has lacked some form of baptism and Christian testimony. Think about Apollos, for example, Apollos of Alexandria. Someone had to be already resident in Alexandria in order for him to have learned what he must have learned as a man of God, a man of Scripture, in Alexandria, as the text says. Another fact that I just want to point out as a basis for thinking about this nexus is the early concentration of believers in the post-apostolic period. Where did large concentrations of believers first occur? Well, certainly in Anatolia, that is in the central part of Turkey and in the northern part of what we today call Turkey. But the other place where there was obviously a great concentration of believers quite early is in Africa. Why has there been less attention paid to this fact? It has been acknowledged by the demographers and historians, but why have we not seen more discussion of that simple fact? Why Africa? Why so early? Why so early in the Nile Valley? Why so deep south in the Nile Valley? Why in the Majerta Valley? Why in coastal Libya? These questions have not been adequately explored. But think for a moment about why did philosophical reflection and catechetical instruction emerge with such sophistication and profundity in these great cities of Africa, from Alexandria to Cyrene to Carthage and beyond? Why were Clement and Origen and Tertullian of such an early date? Why were the key figures with these connections to Cyrene, people like Lucius and Mark, along with Barnabas, viewed by both Paul and Luke as important enough to be considered major figures in the early Christian mission? On what documentary basis besides Papias, did Eusebius hold to the firm view that Mark preached and died in Egypt? But there are many, many more who had no voice at all. They were tortured, they were killed, they are not known to us, but they were there. All these years, Christianity has had a home in Africa. It is not a recent import. That is a modern myth. The modern myth of the recent entry of African Christianity through colonialism as a late arrival is something that you don't see anywhere in the literature until the 19th century. If African Christianity is colonialist, then Islamic history has to be a much later arrival. All three of the Abrahamic families, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, remember a history of salvation that had its earliest beginnings right there on the hub of these two continents, Asia and Africa. And Libya is in continuity, in a contiguous relationship with that hub. The next point has to do with Paleo-Christian believers in Cyrene. I want to unpack this evidence. I'm not going as quickly as I thought I would be going in these lectures, but I think it's important that I just take it step by step so you'll see how the sequence unfolds. I will be presenting a kind of pattern or gestalt of circumstantial evidence that all is drawn together by a certain premise. The premise that I'm trying to show is that there is a very strong connection between Messianic Jews of Cyrene and the early Christian community in Jerusalem. That has a great deal of evidence for it, and you just have to draw that evidence from a lot of different quarters. So that's why my presentation here will be a little bit fragmented and scattered, but it all has a single purpose. The point is that some sort of primitive Messianic Jewish proto-Christian presence in Libya was very powerful in the first century that connected somehow with the earliest witnesses to Jesus Christ as Lord. That's in the first century. And by the second century, they were certainly in Tripolitania, in Leptis Magna. So if this is true, then it is possible for us to speak of 7 centuries, that is, first century through the 7th century, of Christian presence in Libya. But I think it's more prudent to speak of clear documentation in 5 centuries, that is, the centuries between 180 and 680 AD, that is, between Irenaeus and the Arab victory. I use the word presence in a different sense from occupation. Presence and occupation are different in that Christian presence is a theological term concerning the work of the Spirit. It is how the Spirit works to bring the body of Christ, the presence of Christ, into a concrete ministry of witness and community and service. Whereas occupation has military and political meanings that don't necessarily associate with the doctrine of Christian presence. In any event, the true story needs to be uncovered here. And anybody that begins to dig into this case, the case of early Libyan Christianity, feels always like a kind of relentless, slow detective, gradually unfolding tiny bits of circumstantial evidence. And there's no attorney around to make the defense. This has been a defenseless client for centuries. In this case, the victim that we're talking about is the dead and buried and forgotten generations of faithful Libyan Orthodox Christian believers. The modern prosecutors, of course, are people like Harnack and Bauer, and more recently Bart Ehrhardt and Helmut Kester, and those who have understood that the Libyan experience, which they never mention, is completely can be almost completely circumvented. You never mention it. So this community has not had an advocate for many centuries, since the earliest centuries, to attest to the beauty and the holiness, courage, and saintliness that was once found among indigenous Christians in North Africa. Now, my theme has to do with the beginnings of Libyan Christianity, and the basic point here is a simple one. It's much earlier than often imagined. I want to try to show how the beginnings of Christian presence in Cyrene go back to the origins of Christianity itself in Jerusalem. The story of this Jewish Cyrenic Jerusalem connectivity begins, of course, with a familiar figure, Simon of Cyrene of the New Testament narrative. It also begins, I believe, with the Gospel of Mark, but that case is a harder one to make, a more complex one to make. I believe it can be made. I'm not going to try to make that case in these lectures, but in a separate discussion, I will be making that case. Mark, by common memory in Orthodox Africa, was from Cyrene in Libya. That's in terms of the memory of the Synaxarium, the recollection of the saints, and the transmission of the tradition in the Coptic tradition. We meet Mark with other Cyrenaic Jews in Jerusalem. And repeatedly, these accounts take us from Jerusalem to Antioch. And they take us from Antioch. These are Cyrenaic Jews who believe in Jesus Christ. And from Antioch to Cyprus, and from Antioch to Anatolia, and from Antioch to Ephesus, Antioch to Rome. And finally, at least according to the African tradition, bring Mark back to Libya, and only after his return to Libya, where reportedly he had many miracles and had many converts in Libya, before he goes to Alexandria on two different occasions, the second of which was his martyrdom. That's the oral tradition that has largely been dismissed by our wonderful historiographer colleagues. So the African chronology of Mark is very, very different than the European chronology of Mark. You can just only guess why. Now, if this is the case, the first arrival of Christianity in Libya is really much earlier than most of us have been taught. I think the primary evidence for this is essentially an intra-textual examination of New Testament text, four of them in particular, Mark 14, Acts 12:12, and I would put on the list two more crucial ones, 1 Peter 5:13, and more problematically, but nonetheless, there is Romans 16:13. I will be dealing with these briefly, but not in a systematic way. They'll all be woven into a larger narrative. What I'm saying is that it requires examination of these textual evidences that confirm a very stable oral tradition that has to do with martyrdom, and has archaeological evidence backing it up, and has a lot of epigraphic evidence that confirms. But all of this evidence really has not been explored, essentially, in contemporary scholarship of the last 100 years. At least not in sufficient depth. It has been, you can find some literature, of course, about each one of these episodes and each one of these pericopes, but I think they haven't been connected. The dots have not been connected, and that's what I'm hoping to do. The next frame is 15, the reconstruction of early Christian presence in Cyrene. I want to talk about some hypotheses that I think are testable. I mean by testable in relationship to the text itself. First has to do with what I would call the fungible Jewish presence. I mean by that the mobility, the malleability, the flexibility of the Jewish diaspora community that was present in Jerusalem, present in Cyrene, present in Cyprus, present in Tarsus, and so forth. There were a lot of connections that I want to try to point out between that Messianic Jewish presence in Cyrene, in the Jewish quarter of Cyrene, and the narrative of the New Testament. First of all, I want to indicate that this is a repeatedly reported connection. It's an active connection of Jews from Cyrene with the apostles in Jerusalem, sometimes in conflict, sometimes in synchrony. That also applies to the mission in Antioch. This is repeatedly attested Persons from Cyrene or associated with Cyrene appear in the gospel narratives, and I'm thinking here of many of the characters in Luke's narrative in Acts, and certainly in the context of the Gospel of Mark. I think that Luke is especially important in reporting this presence, the presence of the Cyrenaic element in early Christianity, in the most crucial times. Think of it for a moment. We're talking about the institution of the Lord's Supper. We're talking about the crucifixion, Pentecost, and the commissioning of Paul and Barnabas to their first missionary journey. All four of those moments has clear textual evidence of a Cyrenaic voice and impact, along with the testimony of Mark himself. Now, this stands in continuity with an extensive Jewish history. There was a prosperous Jewish trading community residing in Cyrene for more than 200 years before Christians arrived. Messianic Jews formed the core of this earliest Cyrenaic Christian community, in my view. That's an assertion, and I hope to be able to show the pattern of evidence that supports it. This is a Jewish expatriate community in Africa who was composed over these many, many years of Jewish war prisoners, displaced persons fleeing from war and persecution, and in many cases by forced deportation. And before this, there were seagoing commercial traders and local Jewish artisans and scholars in Cyrene. The faithful of these Jewish communities had this time-honored practice of returning to Jerusalem for the great festivals of the Jewish year, such as Passover and Pentecost. Now, these were staunchly observant Jews living in Cyrene. They remained resolutely Jewish, even though there was that distance. All of these Libyan Jews would certainly have learned Greek. That was the lingua franca, and many of them would have known Hebrew or some Hebrew, and probably some Aramaic, and I believe they would have known, this is an international city, they would have known some Latin. Personally, I'm convinced that Mark must have spoken Latin in order to be the interpreter of Peter in a Roman setting where, as reported by Papias and by Eusebius. So this was the community that was sending these faithful Jews to Jerusalem, or they found their own way to these seasonal festivals. And in fact, they founded a congregation there, a congregation of Cyrenaic and other diaspora Jews that we read about in Acts 6:9. And some of these people, my guess is almost all of them, became quite early drawn into the ministry of Jesus, some by being offended by it, and some by being drawn to it in faith. Now, among these, in my view, was clearly a remarkable human being, the mother of John Mark. It would be a great exercise in the history of exegesis to see what you can find concerning the mother of John Mark. I haven't done that myself, but I think it would be fascinating to look at that. At the time Christianity was first spreading to Libya, which I would say somewhere between 30 and 300 AD, there were known Jewish synagogues in many locations in Africa. I just want to mention the ones that I happen to know about. One in Tingis, which is Tangiers, one in Volubilis, which is inland Morocco, in Tapaza in Sisyphus. Those are both in Mauritania. There's Sirta and Hipporegius, which are in Numidia, and Lambesis also, and then Utica and Carthage, which would be in proconsular Africa, which we call Tunisia, also Hadramedum. All of these were places where we know that there were Jewish communities at that time. Now, for Libya, we know that there were Jews in Oye, that's what we call Tripoli today, Leptis Magna, Berenice, which we call Benghazi, Ptolemais, and Cyrene and Apollonia, but there are others, some of them quite far inland, where we have epigraphic evidence of Jewish burials. I think that in the ensuing years, after the events connected with Jesus of Nazareth, his life, ministry, death, and resurrection, these communities would emerge out of the Messianic believers in these places where there were diaspora Jews in Africa. Many of these were in commercial trades, and some of them were seaworthy trading folk, people who were involved in far-flung business enterprises of various kinds, with close connections with Cyrene, with Cyprus, with Alexandria, with Tarsus, with Caesarea Palestina, with Antioch. I mean, these were Mediterranean Jews. These were all Greek-speaking Jews. African Greek-speaking, faithful Messianic Jews. And I think there are strong indicators that they were among the core of those who intentionally were spawning the faith in Jesus Christ to Gentile congregations, wherever they went. They were proclaiming this good news. Proclaiming it first to their Jewish colleagues, but also, in time, to Gentiles. The transition of Christianity from a Jewish sect to Gentile Christianity, we don't know the time frame here. We know that it happened. We don't know exactly how and in what time frame it happened. But I think that transition owes a great deal to Messianic believers from Cyrene. There is a European Enlightenment skepticism about Mark that makes the assumption, it's a proud and self-serving assumption in my view, that Mark never got to Africa. We just don't have the evidence. I think this is in part based upon a myth of the inaccessibility of Africa. It ignores the basic point that I've been trying to make this morning about the connectivity between the North African coast and Jerusalem by two means, by Roman roads and by sea lanes. Now let's go on to frame 16 and talk about the names of Cyrenaic Jews in the New Testament. You probably haven't thought much about this, but I want to point it out. It's a connection that goes very deep, and there is a long list. First of all, everybody knows about Simon of Cyrene. We know where he's from because it states his place of birth in two of the gospel narratives. We know that he was present in the crowd on the way to the crucifixion, and we know that he assisted Jesus in bearing the cross. We all have that mental picture in our minds, having read the New Testament narrative. But do you recall, as Mark did recall, that two of Simon's sons were involved in the Jerusalem Christian community in the first century? Do you know their names? Got it. Alexander and Rufus, two sons. Now, how did Mark know the name? How did he have such a personal relationship with this family? I have the feeling, this is maybe just a subjective judgment, but I have the feeling he knew that family somehow. Look at Mark 15:21, for example, and you will see that I think this is. It's not accidental that it was Mark's gospel that mentions the names personally. And then there is Labius, who is a more problematic figure, but he's one of the ones that Matthew names as the 10th of the 12 apostles. Greek Labius, whose alternative name quite probably was Thaddeus. And he is numbered among the 70, mentioned in Luke 10:3. And the name itself may have a Libyan origin. What is the evidence for his Libyan identity? It would be his name itself, that is, from the root word for Libya, Libu or Lebu or Libu. Labius, according to Coptic tradition, preached the gospel in Libya. In fact, he was the one who, according to the Synaxarium, was the first bishop of the Pentapolis appointed by Mark himself. Now, there are many more. Jews from Cyrene also were present at Pentecost. Let's just review the text, Acts 2:10. On the day of Pentecost, we hear that there were people there in Jerusalem from, I'm quoting, parts of Libya near Cyrene. Now, this is an area location. It's not a specific city location, but somehow the writer of the gospel knew this. The writer of Acts knew this, that he knew where these people were from, or at least he had gotten what he regarded as reliable reports of where they were from, and some of them spoke the native language of Libya. At least so the text says. What is that native language of Libya? Well, you could argue that it is Greek, but I think that doesn't make much sense in terms of the text. I think it would have to be Libyo-Punic, because we already have accounted for Greek. The whole narrative has been written in Greek, and we're talking about the ways in which God the Spirit is working through the various native languages, descending as with tongues of fire upon the early church. And that is where the worldwide mission of the church is suddenly, I believe suddenly, by God's revelation, grasped. I think that the Spirit simply lets the church know about this. It's going everywhere. It's going every tongue, everywhere. And think about it. If my line of argument is right, that moment contained within it a group of voices from this Cyrenaic Jewish community that had become, in some sense, embryonic preliminary disciples of Jesus of Nazareth. Then take Acts 6:9, the stoning of Stephen. We know that Jews from Cyrene were present there. They were a part of his being stoned. Then there is Lucius of Cyrene, who's first mentioned in the New Testament in company with Barnabas, who had family connections with people in Cyrene. We know this. And another person noted in that text as Simeon, or Simon, called Niger. That is Simon the Black, as well as others, Manaen and, of course, Saul. These are prophets and teachers in the earliest Christian community in Antioch, Acts 13:1. By the time of the writing of Paul's letter to Rome, there were a number of believers living in Rome already. And Paul announced his travel plans to them. He says, I'm going to go to Spain. And I'm going to visit you on the way. That's Romans 15:28. And one of the people that was living there in Rome was named Rufus. Now, whether this is the same Rufus, son of Simon of Cyrene, we don't know for sure. But I would say it's evident that he's the only candidate I can think of that we have. It is conjectural, but it surely should not be ruled out that Paul is talking about the same Rufus that Mark was talking about. But there's a more explicit part of this little episode, Romans 16:13. In his letter, Paul is affectionately greeting not only Rufus, who he says is chosen in the Lord, he also speaks very warmly and very personally of the mother of Rufus. Now, why did he do that? Why did he speak of the mother of Rufus? Because she had been like a mother to him. We don't know why. We don't have the details of the story, but we do know that Paul had some great connection, apparently, with that family. So, the personal warmth of that greeting suggests some kind of a relationship that may have prevailed. This is speculative, I agree, between Paul and the Cyrenaic community in Jerusalem. They were all diaspora Jews. We don't know whether Paul was a member of that community that was called the Congregation of the Freedmen, but it certainly shouldn't be ruled out. It's possible. It makes it tempting for us to imagine, and perhaps even suspect, that Mark's mother and Rufus's mother, now you'll think I'm jumping off the cliff here. Mark's mother and Rufus's mother and Paul could have been joined together by some unseen tie. I'm not speculating on what that tie was. It could be familial, it could be friendship, it could be friendship in the gospel, I'm not sure. But something was going on there. Otherwise, I can't hypothesize, I can't explain that text of Mark 16:13 without some kind of hypothesis. Furthermore, if distant Spain was on Paul's and Mark's itinerary, there's no reason to think it impossible that Paul himself might also have had on his itinerary and in his mind even less distant places in North Africa. They were not as far away as Spain. So why are there so many Cyrenians? I think I've already mentioned 7 by name, but there are many more by inference. Frame 17, the messianic activism of the Cyrenaic Jews and Christians in Jerusalem and Antioch. I want to talk about the debate going on among the Cyrenaeans about Jesus. This is Acts 6. Jews from Cyrene were active disputants in a controversy with Stephen, who was to be a martyr. Acts 6, 8 through 10 says, Stephen, full of grace and power, did great wonders and signs among the people. He was causing trouble for some of these Cyrenaic Jews in Jerusalem. They didn't like this. And then some of those who, continuing the quote, some of those who belonged to the synagogue of the freedmen, as it was called, these are Cyrenaeans, Alexandrians, and others from, listen to this, Cilicia. Where's Paul from? Paul could have been in that group, and Asia. So these are the people that rose up, and they argued with Stephen. This was a public argument. Regardless of whether they became believers or not, this shows that the Cyrenaic Jews in Jerusalem were very attentive to what was happening at that very earliest stage of Christian missionary development. They questioned Stephen, but as Luke says, they couldn't stand up against him, his wisdom, or the Spirit by whom he spoke. So we learn from this that the Jews from Cyrene were actively engaged in some kind of debate about who Jesus was and what his death and resurrection meant, or alleged resurrection meant, to all Jews everywhere. And these are people that had a very activist spirit. They didn't just sit around and talk. They were zealous activists. Here's Luke's language, Luke 6:12. They stirred up the people. That is, they went straight to the populace, the people. They stirred up the people and the leadership. They went to the elders and the teachers of the law. They didn't want to leave Stephen out there performing miracles without some kind of challenge. Some of them were so perturbed with early Christian preaching that they not only had Stephen arrested, but they brought him before the Sanhedrin and they presented false witnesses against him, according to Luke. And even their charge is mentioned in the text. Here's their charge. We've heard him say, we know that this guy's been going around talking about Jesus of Nazareth, and he's going to destroy this place. He's already said so. He's going to change the customs that Moses handed down to us. That's the charge. And it cost Stephen his life. Why was Stephen so embarrassing to these Cyrenaic Jewish believers, Messianic believers? So much so that it would not only divide them up as a community, but they would bring deadly charges to him. Now, what's the implication of this? I see my time is up again. The implication, very briefly, is this. I'll try to be just as concise as I can be. Was Stephen himself a Cyrenaic Jew? Think of the implications of that, you see. Now, I'm not saying that Stephen was a Cyrenaic Jew, but I think there are lots of evidences that point in that direction. If so, the first Christian martyr was from Africa, wasn't he? Think about it. The first Christian martyr was from Africa. And martyrdom would later become the seed of the church, and we learned that from another African, Tertullian. Did this awareness of the readiness to share in Jesus' death somehow arise out of an African ethos that had been made ready for it by the Holy Spirit? I can't help but conclude probably so. And if the first Christian martyr to follow the martyrdom of Jesus was himself an African, what does that mean for the African church today?